I'm going to go ahead and get started. And if people trail in, they can catch up. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jim Schneider. I'm the owner and head coach at Power Up Cycling. And this is the second in our series of winter seminars about all things endurance sport. And tonight we're going to talk about VO2Max testing, lactate threshold testing, and functional threshold testing. All of these things are kind of similar, but they're also kind of different. And I think there's a lot of confusion around these various tests and what they're measuring and how you can use them. And hopefully tonight we can clear some of that confusion up. I would encourage everybody that if they have questions as I'm going along, you can just shoot me a chat or unmute yourself and ask me straight away. Because I want everybody to get as much as they can out of tonight's discussion. So first thing, definitions, VO2Max. VO2Max is basically your maximal aerobic capacity, which is the highest rate of oxygen consumption that you can achieve during exercise. Your lactate threshold, by contrast, is the exercise intensity at which there is an exponential increase in the blood lactate concentration because of the breakdown of glycogen in the muscles that exceeds the body's ability to metabolize the lactate that's produced as a byproduct of that glycogen breakdown. Another metric that we'll talk about, but to keep in mind here, is what your oxygen consumption is at lactate threshold. And then the final thing we're going to discuss tonight is functional threshold. In functional threshold, a lot of people refer to it as FTP, functional threshold power, but basically it's the average power output that you can maintain for a 1 hour maximal effort on fresh legs. And that's one of those little side notes that people kind of leave out sometimes, but if you're doing a functional threshold test, whether you're doing a full hour or some of the other protocols, the shorter protocols, you always want to do those tests on fresh legs. So let's start with the VO2Max test. So basically the VO2Max test, it's a step test. You're hooked up to an ergometer or a smart trainer like this young man is in this picture. And they put this mask on you. And basically this mask is collecting all of your expired gases. So it is measuring your CO2, your expired CO2, as well as the oxygen you're consuming. And basically every X minutes, and there are different protocols out there. The protocol we use is every minute. The wattage goes up a fixed amount. And in this case, it goes up 20 watts. And you just keep going and going and going until failure. And the output of this test is you get a heart rate. You get your VO2Max, which is measured in milliliters per kilogram per minute. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And you get a range of heart rates that you can train to, your training zone heart rates. And it's a very, very accurate measure of your metabolic activity because it's actually measuring your body, what your body is inhaling, i.e. how hard it's working, and what it's exhaling. What's a good, one of the questions we get all the time is, what's a good VO2 max? So your average non-trained male has a VO2 max of roughly 30 to 40. Your average non-trained female has a VO2 max of 27 to 30. And again, this is in milliliters of oxygen. We're talking about oxygen consumed per kilogram of body weight per minute. That's the unit of measure. Elite athletes can climb as high as 90 millimeters per kilogram per minute in terms of males, and females as high as 80 to 75. On your right here are some of the readings from some of the well-known athletes. You can see Greg LeMond up there. You can see Thor Hushoff, Miguel Indurain. And one of the interesting thing is you'll notice you've got a lot of cross-country skiers up there. You've got a lot of cyclists up there. But really, you only have a handful of runners up there, which I think is very, very interesting. And I don't think it's that runners don't have high VO2 maxes. One of the things I think is there's the economy of movement and running plays a bigger part in a runner's success than just the VO2 max. And there's a lot of research on that. But that definitely seems to be the case.
Where's Mike Ludwig on that scale?
You'll have to ask Mike. Another useful metric that comes out of a VO2 max test is the respiratory exchange ratio. And this is the ratio of the volume of carbon dioxide you exhale versus the volume of oxygen that you consume at a given exercise intensity level. And the lower the respiratory exchange ratio is, the more that means you're consuming more oxygen than the carbon dioxide you're releasing, and you're typically burning fats in that scenario. And once we get into the lactate, we start talking about lactate here, blood lactate. If at this point in time, you're not accumulating blood lactate in your blood because you're taking in enough oxygen to help metabolize that lactate. And you're not having to rely on 100% carbohydrates to fuel your activity. So respiratory exchange ratio of 0.85 means that you're burning approximately 50% fats and 50% carbohydrates. When you get to respiratory exchange ratio of 1, that means you're burning primarily carbohydrates. And that is pretty close to your lactate threshold number. And it's probably another term you could use for that is your anaerobic threshold. Because basically at that point in time, when you're burning primarily carbohydrates, the component of the large percentage of your energy that you're producing is anaerobic energy. And that is typically a little higher than your lactate threshold. But they're very close. Good approximation for both of those. So let's move on to lactate. Let's talk a little bit about lactate. So what is lactate? Basically, it's a byproduct of glycolysis. And what glycolysis is your body stores glycogen in your muscles and in your liver. And that's the primary source of energy that the cell uses at a cellular level in the mitochondria. And one of the byproducts of breaking down that glycogen is lactate. if you're producing a minimum amount of lactate, your body is able to metabolize that lactate and use it as fuel. When the lactate starts to build up, that basically means that you're burning more and more glycogen, which, you know, glycogen is carbohydrates. You can think of those as being pretty synonymous. You're burning more and more glycogen, and because of that, you're kind of overwhelming the system, if you would, and the concentration of lactate in your muscles and in your blood starts to increase because your body can't metabolize it as fast as you're creating. So we talked a little bit about its lactate being the byproduct of glycolysis, about the fact that if the quantities of lactate are low enough that your body does in fact metabolize it and uses it for fuel. Some of the misconceptions are that lactate causes fatigue or causes muscle soreness, or that burning sensation that you get in your muscles. That's really not what's happening. Or I mean, it's happening for sure. We've all felt it, but lactate is not the source of that. Basically, it's hydrogen ions caused by the splitting of ATP outside of the mitochondria. And that's what's causing that burning sensation. But lactate is, as lactate accumulates, it is a measure of stress, metabolic stress, and it is a measure of fatigue, for sure. So a lactate test, how do we do a lactate test? A lactate test is also a step test, but we're not worried about gas exchange. So we're not collecting gases or measuring gases. Basically what we measure is, we measure heart rate, we measure perceived exertion, and we measure blood lactate with a little measuring device that looks a lot like a glucose meter. And once again, it's a step test. So every X minutes, and in our case, it's every 3 minutes, the wattage goes up 20 watts. And we just keep measuring. And basically, this is a test of failure also. And then that information is plotted, similar to the information that's plotted from in a VO2Max test. And from that, I'm going to skip ahead and show you what a plot looks like. So this is what a plot looks like. So the blue line is lactate, and the red line is heart rate. And that yellow vertical line that's this particular individual's lactate threshold at this particular moment in time. Yep. So basically, a lactate test provides insight into what's happening within the body from a physiological standpoint. You can actually, from that, because you know there's a relationship between the lactate level and your lactate threshold and your respiratory exchange ratio, it gives you pretty good insight, pretty accurate insight as to what sort of fuel you're burning at any power level. When you're talking about cyclists, for runners, it would be pace and heart rate, and cyclists is heart rate too. It's not just power. It's like at this heart rate, you know, this is the fuel I'm primarily using. At this heart rate, this is the fuel I'm primarily using. And that's really, really important to know. Because at the end of the day, obviously we're trying to make, in terms of endurance sports, efficiency is hugely important. And we're trying to make our engines as efficient as possible. And in order to do that, we have to start by building the aerobic component of our fitness. And both the VO2Max test and the lactate threshold test give us insight into at what heart rates and power levels we're performing aerobically, and at what heart rates and power levels we're performing anaerobically. And we'll get into the functional threshold test here in a couple minutes, but that particular test doesn't give us that insight. One of the drawbacks to the lactate threshold test is for a lot of athletes, it's not readily available. And for the person administering the test, the test results are sometimes hard to interpret, just being perfectly honest. But it does typically give you pretty useful information. So we talk, why is that important? It's important because you can better dial in your training. Everybody, I don't think anybody on the call here is a professional cyclist or professional triathlete. Could be wrong, but I don't think so. So we all have limited training time. And because we have limited training time, we want to make get the most out of the time that we're training, whether it's running or swimming or cycling or whatever. We want to minimize the junk, what are typically called the junk miles, and put in quality time. Quality time doesn't necessarily mean you're always out there beating your head in. Quality time means you're working on the specific fitness component, metabolic component, if you would, that you're trying to get to change. So this time of year, most of us are out there building base miles. And if we're out there building base miles, we don't want to be doing 1 minute on, 1 minute off intervals. We don't want to be doing sprint training. We don't want to be doing zone 5, efforts. We want to be working that aerobic engine and making that aerobic engine as efficient and as large as we can possibly make it. Because it all, it's the old, and it's very old at this point, the old adage that, the bigger the base of the pyramid, the taller the pyramid gets, is absolutely true. Because I could give somebody, for 6 weeks, I could give them a set of intervals to do, even right this time of year. And, they would see some pretty fantastic results in 6 weeks. But those results wouldn't last. Because they haven't built their base first. And those results wouldn't be as good as they could be had they built their base first. The other thing about the lactate threshold test and the VO2Max test, and for that matter, the functional threshold test, is you should test periodically. And what does that mean? How often do you test? Kind of depends on what your training is, how many hours a week you're putting in training. But I would say probably really don't need to test more often than every couple months. But I wouldn't go longer than a quarter. So somewhere between 2 and 4 months. Every 2 and 4 months you should test and update your training zones. Because if you're getting stronger and stronger and stronger and you're not updating your training zones and you're training to your zones, then you're underworking. So this is a typical test and lactate threshold test. And like I said, the blue line is blood lactate. The red line is your heart rate. And this is one of our clients, and this was the fall of 2017. And he's coming off of it was either 4 or 6 weeks of D training. It was post Gateway Cup. And for 4 to 6 weeks, he pretty much didn't do anything other than maybe coffee shop rides. So this was sort of setting the baseline for his 2018 season. So he started training after we did this test. Once again, he's building his engine, and that was in December. So you'll notice, one of the things you'll notice is how much flatter that blue line is. And that's actually, to me, at this point in the year, that's actually more important than the fact that his threshold, that vertical yellow line, moved out a little bit. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get that blue line flat as long as possible, because as long as that blue line is flat, you're burning fats. And you're not dipping into your glycogen stores in your muscles and in your liver. And everything I've ever read says that you're in the absence of any intake of calories, you have 90 minutes of glycogen stored in your muscles and in your liver. If everything is kind of topped off, if you would. And I've actually had a couple of athletes over the years who I swear to God, you could set your watch by their glycogen burn, because at 90 minutes they would just pop. If they didn't have, like, if all they were drinking in a race was water, it was just like, I mean, literally, you could almost set your watch by it. Anyway, so this was December, okay, and on through the months of January and February, we continued to work on this young man's aerobic engine, and there you go. You can see that it's even flattened out more. So the thing to note is, going back here, so here, the curve starts getting steep at 200 watts, 200 being on the horizontal axis at the bottom. And 4 months later, after 4 months of building the base, his curve doesn't start getting steep until 260 watts. So he went from starting to burn carbs at 200 watts in December to not starting to really burn carbs until 260 watts in February. And that's a huge improvement. Think about that. How much longer you can go if you're burning fats rather than your limited glycogen stores. Did somebody have a question?
I just said, wow, is all, Jim.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, that's, not everybody has these results. But that was pretty damn impressive. But it does, I mean, but I guess one of the points is not to point out what a great job this young man did, but it was more a point of what useful information you can get out of these tests that you can't necessarily get out of a FTP test. And I'm not here to slam FTP tests, because FTP tests have their place in training, I believe, personally, but not at this stage of training. At this stage of training, my belief is your training should be guided by your heart rate, because your heart rate is a measure of how hard your body is working. Power is a measure of how much work you're doing. And those are two very different things. And when you're trying to build your aerobic engine, you want to know how hard your body is working, because you want to know what fuel your body is using, because you want to make it an efficient fat burning machine. This is actually another interesting set of graphs. So this client she's a smaller woman. I think she probably weighs about 110 or 115 pounds, but obviously she's very strong. Because at 110 or 115 pounds, if your threshold is at 260, you're pretty damn strong. But this was in, I think, the December, January timeframe. And at some point in your season, you have to go to anaerobic training. But there's a price to be paid for that. And that's why, even though I could take an athlete right now and put them on 6 weeks of interval training and make them fast, this is the price that they're paying. So pay attention. So this curve starts going up at 220 and then starts getting steep at 260. Same person after a season of racing. So what happened? This went from that to that. What happened is she started racing and she started doing harder training. So everything, when you look at a lactate threshold curve like this, everything to the right of that vertical yellow line is anaerobic, pretty much. It's not purely black and white. It's kind of shades of gray, but for the most part, it's anaerobic. Everything to the left is primarily aerobic. So look at the slope from 260 to 280 in December. It's pretty steep, which means her anaerobic engine wasn't very good at that point. Look at the slope now, pretty shallow. So that means all of that racing and all of that high intensity training improved her anaerobic engine. But look what it did to her aerobic engine in terms of where the curve starts going up on this graph versus where this curve starts going up on that graph. So that's why, because this phenomena happens, and it's well documented. This is not an anomaly. This is a well documented phenomenon, and you have to do anaerobic training. If you're racing in this type of race that takes anaerobic efforts like criteriums, time trials, track racing, shorter triathlons, you've got to do some anaerobic training. Otherwise, you won't be successful. But if you do too much of it, you're eating away at your aerobic capacity, your aerobic engine. Anybody got any questions? I'm going to kind of pause here and see if anybody's got any questions up to this point. Okay. Hopefully that's because this is all crystal clear. Okay, so let's talk about functional threshold power. So first of all, the functional threshold, the FTP test, as it's known, was originally derived as a field test to approximate the lactate threshold because of all the shortcomings of the lactate threshold test. It's not readily available. Sometimes the results are hard to interpret, that kind of thing. And this is a more almost seat of the pants test, although it is, it has become the de facto standard for for a lot of people and a lot of coaches. And basically what it is it is the measure of, like we talked about earlier, it's if you went out on fresh legs and did a 1 hour time trial and looked at the average watts, that's what this is. And there's a lot of different protocols to measure this. Most coaches and most athletes don't want to do an hour test. So they have the 20-minute test is really popular. Some people do an 8-minute protocol where they do multiple 8-minute tests with fixed rest times in between. And then they put a correction factor on that to actually calculate the FTP test. And basically the goal of those shorter tests obviously is to predict your FTP. One word of caution here is, in science in general, and not exercise physiology in particular, although it certainly applies to exercise physiology, is the further away you get from what you're actually trying to measure, the more questionable your end result is. So what I mean by that is the most accurate measure of FTP is a 1 hour test, because you are doing exactly what you're trying to measure. A 20-minute test is not as accurate as an hour test, although it's easier to do mentally. And an 8-minute test is not as accurate as a 20-minute test, because you're getting further and further away from what you're actually trying to measure. Just a word of caution there. But I mean, you know, one of the great things about an FTP test is it's really easy to do. You can do it on a smart trainer at home. You can do it on a training ride, you know, on a flat piece of ground, or on a training ride on a steady climb. It does not give you heart rate, or it does not give you heart rate training zones. And it does not tell you what fuel you're burning at any point at any power level or heart rate. But it does give you power numbers. And one of the reasons power was originally adopted for a training purpose is because with heart rate, there's a delayed response, meaning that if I wanted to do a set of 5 by 5 minute zone 5 intervals, in my zone 5 heart rate was, let's say, between 160 and 170. In that first interval, my heart rate might not even get up to 170, 160 to 170, because there's a delay. Even with a good warm-up, there's a delay in the reading. So, whereas power, you get an instant, as soon as you start, you know exactly what you're doing. So I would argue that for that reason, power is better, is probably a better metric to use when you're doing interval type training, because you do get that instantaneous feedback. You don't have to wait for your heart rate to catch up to what you're doing. So that way you won't undershoot or overshoot the intensity that you should be at for that particular effort. Some of the drawbacks to FTP testing is not everybody is good at testing. And some people, I can tell you from experience in the center, that some people just don't want to do an FTP test. They just, I mean, they would rather put finger or put toothpicks in their eyes than doing an FTP test. There's that. And once again, you're measuring how much work you're doing as opposed to how hard the body is working. And with the shorter test, the 8-minute test, even the 20-minute test, if somebody has a very good anaerobic engine, you can kind of mask a poor aerobic engine because the test is too short. Not the case with a 1-hour test. 1-hour test, like I said, you're measuring what you're supposed to be measuring. And in our experience, because of that, the FTP test typically predicts a higher threshold number than a lactate threshold test would. As we've been testing, we've tested hundreds of people over the years since the center's been open. We don't use that 5% correction factor that is in Andy Coggin's book. We use like 7 to 10% correction factor. And that's based on our estimation of how deeply the person dug when they did the test. And we use exclusively the 20-minute protocol. But anyway, I think all of these different tests and these different metrics have a place in training, and they all tell us very useful information. This time of year, like I said, when you're trying to improve your aerobic engine, my preference is always to rely on your heart rate to determine the intensity of your effort. Because you're really trying to, metabolic indicator is the best way to determine if you're staying aerobic. Excuse me. When it gets to be later in the season and in season, when you're doing intervals, and that instantaneous feedback is important, then I think you actually have to rely on power to monitor your efforts. And you could make the argument that, once the racing season starts, power becomes more important, because if you can't put out the watts, you're not going to be there at the end of the event, or you're not going to get the result that you're looking for. So just sort of depends on the time of year. But I think it's still useful, even though you may not be using a lactate threshold test or a VO2 test to guide your training as much. It's still useful to, in my opinion, to get tested to see how things are changing, and make sure that you're not in May and you find out that you've already lost 40 watts of aerobic power because you've been doing too much anaerobic intervals, particularly if it's May and your goal event isn't until August. That would not be a good scenario to be in. And this one, I had to throw this slide up. I found it when I was doing some of the research for this talk, and I thought it was like super cool. And it's kind of related to the talk, but it's kind of not related to the talk, but it's a really cool slide. So basically what it's talking about here is how all of this stuff is interrelated. Okay, so the upper third of the figure is your performance. You got your performance velocity, your performance power, your performance oxygen consumption. This is all about performance. This is about race results. This is about ride results. I'm going to interject something here that we'll probably talk about in a later talk. But no matter what anybody says, speed wins races, not power, unless you're racing Zwift, then power wins races. But if you're racing in the real world, performance velocity is the most important thing. That's why it's at the top. And I didn't make this figure. But whoever the guy who did that obviously agrees with me. So if you look at, for instance, performance oxygen consumption. So what goes into performance oxygen consumption? Your lactate threshold oxygen consumption plays a role in that. So does your muscle capillary density. We didn't really talk about that. It's beyond the scope of this talk, but that's a very, very important thing when it comes to your aerobic engine in terms of what is the capillary density in your muscles. Because the more capillaries you have, the more blood flow you have. The more blood flow you have, the better you can provide nutrients and take away waste products, i.e. take away lactate and distribute it throughout the body. So you look at lactate threshold power or velocity. It's a function of your lactate threshold oxygen consumption, but it's also a function of economy of movement. And this was a chapter from a book. This came from a chapter from a book. One of the things they were talking about is gross mechanical efficiency. Economy of movement is affected by gross mechanical efficiency, which is affected by your muscle fiber type. And what they found is with endurance athletes, the higher percentage of type 1 fibers, which is slow twitch fibers you have, the more power you can produce at your lactate threshold oxygen consumption. But the other thing they found is that the more muscles you can engage while you're pedaling is, once again, you're getting more muscles engaged, you're getting more mitochondria engaged, and because of that, you're spreading out the work, if you would, across more muscles. And because you're spreading out the work across more muscles, each muscle fiber is doing less work. So it can ultimately produce more power. And that was in this book, they did a really interesting study where they studied this was on 14 cyclists. 7 of them were like state champion cyclists, so obviously very good cyclists. And some of them, 7 of them were national team cyclists, and which made them even a little better than those state champions. And what they found out is, and this sounds like totally simple, like, well, duh, but they found out that the elite athletes can push the pedals down harder than the good athletes. But one of the reasons they attributed that to is because the elite athletes engaged more muscles they didn't rely as much on their quads or solely on their quads. They got their glutes involved in the pedal stroke more than the good cyclists did. And because of that, they could produce more power. So yeah, I just thought this was like the coolest thing. So I had to share it. Sorry. I think, yeah, that's it. Anybody got any questions? Oh, come on, I couldn't have explained it that well.
So this is Mike.
Yeah,
You said it's probably not on this topic, but I think on the use Garmin, right? And part of the Garmin app is it gives you all these other dynamics associated with your pedal stroke, right? And
right.
so you're talking about that muscle efficiency and stuff like that. So, how, I guess,
You're going to ask me how accurate those things are, aren't you?
well, no, I'm not gonna say how accurate they are, but to what degree at our amateur level is it even relevant? I guess that was my point. I mean, like
I mean,
0.1%
it's,
increase.
in regards to, I've always kind of ignored the side to side thing. And I've certainly ignored when it's told me I need 4 days to recover from a workout. It's, to me, the most important thing is what you're trying to achieve with your aerobic training, right? So what are you trying to do? Looking at this figure right here, this is a great figure. So basically aerobic training improves the muscle capillary density. It improves your heart stroke volume. It improves the aerobic enzymatic activity. All of these, and this maximal oxygen consumption, that's VO2 max. Same thing. So all of those things improve your VO2 max. And basically what your VO2 max is it is the upper limit of your lactate threshold oxygen consumption. So a simple way to kind of look at it is when you're building your base training, you're trying to improve get your VO2 max as high as it can go. And to a great extent, your VO2 max is limited by your genetics, how well you picked your parents. And once you've sort of maximized your VO2 max, then what you do is you start working on your threshold. And you get your threshold, you're trying to raise your threshold as close to your VO2 max as you possibly can. And it's much, you can change your lactate threshold oxygen consumption a lot more than you can change your VO2 max.
Mm-hmm.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think that the premise is that it's if you're going to worry about something that's probably easier to change, it's easier to change the other things or improve the other things over just worrying about, I mean, not that I'm worried about it, but just the economy of your pedal stroke or something like that.
Yeah. But you can
not that you can't.
That said, I'm going to put a caveat on that one.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're pedaling, most people can kind of tell if it's quad dominant or if they're getting their glutes involved. And your glutes are powerful damn muscles.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you feel like, you have a quad dominant pedal stroke, you might want to think about, and I'm not talking about you specifically, but you might want to think about you know, is there something about, and I'm not trying to, is there something about my position on the bike that is preventing me from getting my glutes engaged in my pedal stroke? That is worth spending, even for, you know, I mean, I would say any level of cyclist who's trying to improve, that is something that is worth spending some time on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, Mike, this is Mike Ludwig. I have been able to tell that the difference between when I engage my glutes and when I don't, at a, you know, let's say that if I'm going 20, 21 miles an hour, engaging my glutes is worth almost 2 miles an hour. And that's basically by adjusting my mechanics on my pedal stroke. And basically a lot of what that involves is, you've heard the term scraping or mud off your feet. Well, when you pull back on the pedal, you're engaging your glutes. Not to pull up, because you're negating the fact that you're also pulling up the mass of your leg. You don't worry too much about that, but just by pushing forward and pulling back, and not even thinking about pushing down, because that comes natural, that engages more muscles, and you'll see the results right away.
David, did I answer your chat question by talking about the glutes?
I haven't looked at the answer you replied. I thought maybe you were going to talk about it.
No, when I talk about, that was the definition of that I got out of the book, but what they mean by it's they're talking about like all the muscles involved in the activity. Back to that slide.
Yes, that makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
On Mike's point, when he was talking about the pedal stroke,
Mm-hmm.
Mike, if you can add, please. Were you referring from the 6 to 9 position on the pedal stroke? Or are you referring to more 6 to 12 about the pulling up?
Well, it's not that fine, but it's probably more like pulling back on the bottom third of the stroke.
So more like the 4 to 6, right, Mike?
Right.
Thank you.
4 to 6, 4 to 7. You get too far past 4 to 7, then you're pulling up.
Any other questions?
And who was asking about my VO2?
That was me. I was making fun.
Okay. Well, I actually, there's 2 of us on the phone here or on the meeting who have had this test, the VO2Max test done. And I was one of them. I was the guinea pig to check out the protocol.
Yeah. I did one with, I did one running with Amy, and I did one over at Nutriformance on a bike too. They were trying to figure it out, and it didn't go very well. They couldn't get the bike to get the resistance high enough, and so I was like riding forever.
So with the advent of essentially the Wahoo kickers, and the ability to program those in erg mode, we've been able to completely automate that and it's working out pretty well. To where, as a matter of fact, when Fleet Feet does this, and we're doing these at Fleet Feet, when Fleet Feet does the VO2Max test, they manually adjust the speed of the treadmill, and then they adjust the grade that you're running up to increase the resistance. Whereas with the trainer, we can go ahead and automatically increase it by 20 knots every 1 minute.
Yeah,
But
actually, that's something I didn't mention is, in case there are people on the call that don't realize that, is Power Up does have the ability to do all three of these tests. The VO2Max test, the Lactate Threshold test, and the FTP test. So if anybody's interested in any of those, give us a call, shoot us an email, and we can set something up.
yeah,
But I just wanted to go back to this graph again, because there was a point in time, and I think most exercise physiologists have moved away from this, but there was a point in time where there was a belief that if somebody had a high VO2 max, once again, the maximal oxygen consumption on this graph that's all they needed to be a good endurance athlete. And that is, if you look at this graph, there's a lot more to it than that. Because VO2 max is kind of at the bottom. And it feeds into other things, certainly plays a big role, but there's a lot more to endurance, success and endurance athletes than having a super high VO2 max.
It's a building block.
It's a building block, exactly. It's part of the wall, but it's not the whole wall. And all of these other things also play a big role. Some of which are, once again, talking about lactate threshold. One of the things that they talked about, once again, and where this in the book where this came from, was they took, and it's doing any sort of research in exercise physiology is a difficult thing to find the subjects that can, first of all, that can do the test, and second of all, that you can kind of, work together. But long story short is they did a test, and they had, once again, they had two groups of 7, and they matched in one group was good and one group was elite, and they matched VO2 maxes within the group as best they could. Number 1 was matched with number 9, and number 2 was matched with number 5, that kind of thing. And then they once again had them do a performance test. And 100% of the time of the pairs, the person who had the higher lactate threshold oxygen consumption always did better than the other person, even though they had the same VO2 max. So okay, if we don't have any more questions, once again, thank everybody for coming. And if you do have a question, something occurs to you, you can shoot us an email. This give me a couple days and I will post this on our YouTube channel. Everybody have a good evening.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks,
Good night,
Jim.
folks.